Although I won't dive into a full literature review this afternoon, unfortunately, it is necessary to begin this discussion with a brief, very brief, historiographical overview of Viking Age sculptures in Northern England in order to grasp the binary conceptualizations that underpin the labels applied to monuments like the 10th century Middleton cross. This monument in particular has continued to be perceived as an image of the, quote, new Scandinavian elite, end quote, as recently as 2014, a view that reduces the monument to an ethnic signifier. Since the late 19th century, the sculptures bearing figural carving have been considered exceptional depictions of Norse mythological and heroic subject matter, with the result that the monuments were perceived as the products of exclusively pagan patronage, despite many images being preserved on crosses, the preeminent symbol of Christianity. This view established a precedent for 20th century scholars, most notably W.G. Collingwood, whose formalist approach to the Viking Age sculptures was intended to establish chronologies and regional distributions of certain motifs. Collingwood's occasional comments on figural carvings equated them to depictions of mythological subjects preserved in 12th and 13th century Icelandic texts, suggesting that the carvings are subsidiary decorations despite their emergence within a cultural context that is both temporally and geographically removed from that of the later texts. Collingwood's binary understanding of the monuments of the 10th century production of sculpture remained the primary conception of the monuments throughout the 20th century. Since then, only two major studies have addressed the monument's figural iconography. The first, Richard Bailey's 1980 monograph, departed significantly from existing scholarship, but nonetheless prioritized monuments apparently depicting Germanic mythological and heroic subject matter. In 2012, Lula Kopar set out to follow Bailey's approach, but returned instead to formalist interests. By emphasizing so-called pagan figural iconography, these publications have ignored the implications of the carving's preservation on crosses, preventing meaningful consideration of their overall iconographic programs. This fixation on so-called pagan Scandinavian elements originated in 19th century studies of religion that were themselves rooted within the fields of philology and linguistics, where the methodology of using late medieval Icelandic texts to reconstruct the religious practices of early medieval Scandinavian peoples was developed. Certain philologists like Jacob Grimm omitted texts from their studies that contained definitively Christian characteristics because they contaminated the, quote, pure antiquity of the North, end quote, as Annette Lassen observed. The problems inherent in employing later Icelandic texts are now recognized by linguistic scholars, not least because the texts were compiled by writers working under Christian influence. Yet the application of a Christian-pagan binary in art historical and archaeological scholarship persists and is further complicated by using the labels secular and pagan interchangeably. More explicit alternatives to pagan have certainly been applied, such as Norse/Germanic/Scandinavian mythology or cult, but these are also not without complications. For example, Kopar rightly acknowledged that the legendary heroes Wayland the Smith and Sigurd the Volsung are not mythological figures, but simultaneously created a false equivalency between secular, legendary, and pagan subject matter. This implies an erroneous religious element, while Germanic is invoked in the philological sense to encompass legendary and mythological narrative subjects. The labels Norse and Germanic originated in linguistic studies, and Kopar's use implies that traditional beliefs should be defined according to the languages spoken by those holding them. Such perceptions are not limited to sculptural scholarship, of course. In other archaeological discussions, these labels and the material evidence associated with them have also been conflated or used to represent a pan-Germanic or Norse culture rather than a shared linguistic field. Further, replacing pagan with Germanic or Norse implies both linguistic homogeneity amongst the various regions and peoples sharing aspects of the root language and a homogeneity of belief defined by a shared language. Moreover, these terms have a long and turbulent history. They continue to be used and corrupted by white nationalists to support extreme ideologies and agendas, most notably those of the Nazis, and such misappropriations in the political arena have been discussed by Margaret Clunies-Ross and Julia Zernak, among others. Most recently, the misappropriation of Norse imagery in political contexts was a primary feature of discussions regarding the US Capitol insurrection earlier this year, where one of the domestic terrorists displayed tattoos of Norse mythological symbols, including the world tree Yggdrasil and Odinic Valknuts. The conflation of myth and legend, secular and pagan, prevalent in art historical scholarship, highlights persistent misunderstandings of the visual material and the terminology used to denote these distinctions. The casual scholarly use of these labels has unfortunately undermined the nuanced iconographic arrangements of the Viking-age crosses and may also enable them to be misappropriated as ethnic or Norse religious signifiers with potential political ramifications. So what does all of this have to do with the Middleton cross? The near complete cross shaft was removed from the church tower at St. Andrew's in Middleton in 1948 with its counterpart Middleton I, and both sculptures are considered significant evidence for the development of the yelling style in Anglo-Scandinavian England, as well as markers of local taste, combining motifs from Irish, Scandinavian, and Anglian or pre-Viking art. Since then, Middleton too has been perceived as the product of secular pagan patronage due to this figure carved on face A, which has become synonymous with visualizations of the so-called Viking warrior. But are these labels actually relevant to the monument within its historical context? The weapons surrounding the figure have been described as, quote, typically Viking, end quote, for instance, but only the axe can be considered a typical Viking Scandinavian weapon. The explanation of the scheme as depicting an inhumation is the most widely accepted, and although the monument's Christian nature has been acknowledged, the scheme has nonetheless been understood to reflect the 10th century continuation of pagan burial traditions in Christian cemeteries. This implies that the monument was commissioned and erected with this particular motive in mind, suggesting that the patron must have been both Scandinavian and pagan. Yet this perception is clearly contradicted by the selection of the distinct Christian cross form for the scheme's display, which implies that the figure and his suite of martial symbols were intended to be viewed within Christian frames of reference. Alan Binns, the first to analyze the monument, argued that its patron possessed a Norse ethnic identity, as suggested by onomastic evidence, with place names in the region apparently reflecting Norse rather than Danish inhabitants. He therefore proposed that the scheme displayed Norwegian dynastic connections rather than functioning as a portrait of the patron. Unfortunately, using onomastic evidence to establish the Scandinavian or Norwegian ethnic identity of the Middleton patrons is irrelevant here. Middleton itself is an Old English place name and is therefore unlikely to reflect any Scandinavian ancestry among its inhabitants. Furthermore, the pagan religious identity of those responsible for the monument is debatable. Incoming Scandinavians were exposed to insular Christianity from at least the mid to late 9th century, suggesting that the Middleton patrons may have been unaware of their ancestors' pagan burial traditions. The Middleton patrons' exposure to Christianity and Christian monuments is demonstrated by the ring-headed cross that surmounts the shaft, a typological feature considered to be transmitted to Yorkshire only in the early 10th century by those arriving from Ireland or Scotland, who had settled in the region at least 2 generations after Halfdan's initial settlement of Northumbria in 876. Moreover, the absence of grave goods in the few Scandinavian graves found in England undermines the explanation that the carving reflects Scandinavian burial practices. Overall, it is unlikely that the figure was intended to represent a deceased individual, ancestral or otherwise, in a pagan burial context. Of course, other explanations for the scheme have been proposed, with James Lang arguing that the 2 round pellets above the figure's shoulders represent part of a chair, rendering the scheme a depiction of a lordly figure enthroned upon a gift stool, based on descriptions in Old English poetry and later Old Norse sagas. Following Lang, Natalie Russell later observed that the unusual disposition of the figure's right hand, with its thumb positioned to the left, suggests that he's gesturing with his open hand either toward the viewer or to the weapons on his right. These explanations are somewhat unusual, however. The apparent norm was to depict seated figures frontally without weaponry because they were typically ecclesiastical figures, whereas standing or seated profile figures with weapons were understood to be secular. The Middleton figure is thus exceptional, combining the frontal seated ecclesiastical pose with the accoutrements that typically accompany armed standing figures. This arrangement implies that the patron may have deliberately chosen to distinguish his portrait from those of seated ecclesiastical figures and to emphasize his secular social standing, despite the portrait's preservation on a cross shaft. Emphasis on secular social standing finds sculptural analogues on two Anglian monuments from Repton and Bewcastle, albeit with significant differences between their arrangements and that of the Middleton figure. The Repton and Bewcastle figures are considered exceptional in Anglian sculptural contexts as depictions of secular figures, but their arrangements within panels on a cross shaft were nevertheless intended to encapsulate themes of ideal secular lordship, indicated by their attributes of weaponry and falcon. A similar phenomenon potentially occurred at Middleton, where the seated ecclesiastical figure type was appropriated and adapted to portray a secular figure surrounded by markers of lordship. Its display on a monumental cross further suggests that, like the Bewcastle and Repton figures, the monument's patrons intended that he would be viewed within Christian frames of reference, potentially as an ideal Christian lord. If the figure was seated upon a gift stool, this object would have been understood by contemporary audiences as a symbol of the Lord's generosity, power, and authority, as at Nunburnholm. Public displays of secular authority may have been deemed necessary in 10th century Northumbria, given the instability of landholding, which was affected by West Saxon attempts to acquire estates from local landholders, particularly those belonging to Scandinavian settlers or those of Scandinavian descent. This encroachment was intensified by rights granted to the Northumbrian Church, like those apparently granted to Beverley under the aegis of the West Saxon king Ethelstan, enabling this ecclesiastical community to collect grain from every estate in Yorkshire. Social instability may well reveal the motives of the Middleton patrons, who appear to have consciously depicted an enthroned figure with martial symbols according to vernacular Anglo-Scandinavian visual traditions, thereby declaring his status as a local landholder with regional secular authority. Due to the presence of earlier Anglian stone crosses, Middleton has been recognized as a site marking continuity in the local Christian landscape, meaning that the selection of the cross form is significant here. The secular figure is displayed beneath the crosshead, whose proportions are nearly equal to those of the shaft, suggesting that the figure's earthly secular power might also be mediated by his standing within a Christian community. Seeking to underline the articulation of secular authority, Ronald Murphy recently proposed that the crosshead decoration on B and the interlace below were united to present the viewer with, quote, a whole and living tree, end quote, which he regarded as Yggdrasil. For Murphy, the cross arms recalled Yggdrasil's branches and Woden's sacrifice on it, while the chevrons decorating the ringhead symbolized the newly rising sun following Ragnarok. The crosshead, however, belongs to a local regional group, while the stylized carvings, the absence of any identifiable iconographic features that might invoke Ragnarok, and a deficiency of Yggdrasil depictions either elsewhere in Northumbria or Scandinavia, with one extremely debatable exception on Gotland, make this claim difficult to substantiate. Despite the lack of evidence for this interpretation, the Jellinga-style beast on C has nonetheless been associated with mythological episodes involving Ragnarok and Yggdrasil. As noted, the beast is considered an important indicator of the Jellinga-style's development in Viking-age England. It is now recognized as a 10th century attempt at copying Jellinga-style beasts, which find more proficient sculptural analogues at York. Significantly, Bailey argued that there is no explicit relationship between the Middleton patrons' ethnicity and the motif's Scandinavian origins, indicating only that the Middleton patron considered the Jellinga animal acceptable for public display, as opposed to an ethnic Scandinavian identifier. The beast on this monument therefore implies only an interest in appropriating Scandinavian visual languages for public display. Murphy, however, has argued that the beast represents Nidhogg, the serpent living within Yggdrasil's roots. Despite the myths preserved in later Icelandic texts claiming that none of the Norse pantheon were capable of binding Nidhogg, the Middleton creature is clearly bound, with fetters segmenting his body and traversing his jaws and paws, making it extremely unlikely that it represents the allegedly unrestrainable Nidhogg, despite Murphy's somewhat confused insistence that the creature should be identified as such, bound within Christ's cross, forcing the beast, and by extension the monument itself, into a preconceived narrative proving its patron's Scandinavian ethnic and pagan religious identities. Fortunately, other explanations have emerged for this iconographic program that consider its Christian frames of reference. Victoria Whitworth, for instance, regarded the weapons on A as belonging to a spiritual warrior, their symbolic meanings derived either from Exodus chapter 15, verse 3, or Psalm 34, verse 2, enabling the beast on C to be understood as a potential reference to Revelation chapter 20, verse 2. She also recognized a potential relationship to Ephesians 6, a passage invoked in late 10th century homilies by Elfrich and Wulfstan. While the scheme may be understood in isolation as a literal rendering of Ephesians 6, the primary theme of this passage is God's triumph over evil, suggesting that the figure could well be viewed in relation to the bound beast on C. Both potentially invoke Revelation chapter 20, verses 1 through 6, enabling the figure to reference the righteous who abjure the beast. Alternatively, the beast may represent the biblical Leviathan, based on the arrangement of its fetters. The cord bisecting the beast's body and passing through its jaws may be explained as a visual interpretation of Job chapter 40, verses 20 to 21, or Job chapter 40, verse 24, which question whether the Leviathan's tongue can be tied. Early medieval commentators perceived the binding of the Leviathan's jaws as a sign of Christ's triumph over evil. Gregory the Great, for instance, stated that Christ's incarnation caused the Leviathan's jaws to be bound and false doctrines to be silenced. If the bound beast was intended to be viewed this way, then the figure on A may have been understood as a member of the faithful who triumphed over evil through recognizing Christ's incarnation, sacrifice, and salvation, all indicated by the crosshead above. Put another way, the arrangement suggests a highly schematized adaptation of Milites Christi iconography, which circulated in Carolingian contexts. This depicted warrior saints trampling serpents alongside scenes of the Annunciation, Christ as the Agnus Dei, and Christ enthroned with the apostles to symbolize victory over evil facilitated by faith in Christ. By the 9th and 10th centuries, the concept was adapted and applied to secular rulers or warriors, by then understood as defenders of the church. Visual presentations of secular rulers as Milites Christi circulated from the early 10th century, such as this manuscript depiction of Louis the Pious, which emphasizes both his role as defender of the faith and his imperial authority. The Middleton scheme may well articulate this concept, albeit in a different manner. The figure is arranged frontally in a seated pose adapted from those of hieratic ecclesiastical figures to emphasize his secular authority and, by extension, his potential martial successes. The image's placement opposite the fettered beast may have been intended to express the figure's triumph over the beast and the evil it represents through Christian faith, signified by the monument form. The apparent simplicity of the Middleton scheme has been attributed to its patron's apparent illiteracy in either Latin or Old English and an unfamiliarity with the Psalms and other offices of the church, as they were likely to be new converts. This view is anachronistic in the light of the monument's 10th century date, which implies prolonged exposure to insular Christianity and Christian monuments. Indeed, the program's perceived simplicity is probably best explained by late antique and early medieval tendencies to reduce complex real events to stylized and flattened elements arranged on a planar two-dimensional surface. Jane Hawkes has argued that the reduction of three-dimensional space removes the events from depicted real time, emphasizing the authority and relevance of the figure's actions and making them eternal. At Middleton, the attempt to represent a frontal seated figure with the attributes of martial authority has resulted in an analogous flattening of space, while the absence of other contextualizing features has removed the figure from any specific temporal event. Here, eliminating notions of real time or space has created an iconic multivalent portrait that can be understood by the viewer to represent past and future experiences or presences. If the figure is indeed depicted on a gift stool, this arrangement, removed as it is from temporal events and recognizable spaces, would render him eternally fixed in this magnanimous attitude, which the monument's patrons may have considered appropriate if the image was intended to be commemorative. Bearing in mind West Saxon attempts to dominate the region politically, the permanence of the monument's medium and the elimination of temporal settings and/or events from its carvings may reflect a deliberate effort to monumentalize a perpetual claim to the estates controlled by the Middleton lords. The temporal and spatial collapse may also carry implications for understanding the public display of a fettered beast. If this is represented, either the bound Leviathan or the dragon of Revelation, or perhaps both, then its placement opposite the atemporal enthroned figure may indicate intended eschatological references for the scheme, something further suggested by its setting below the crosshead, placing it within the context of Christ's incarnation, sacrifice, and salvation. This enables the figure to be understood as a member of the elect at the second coming, with the beast signifying Christ's triumph over death, evil, and the eradication of sin. Although the Middleton cross appears to display ambiguous pagan images, when viewed within their contemporary context, the carvings are compatible with early to mid-10th century socio-political events. The arrangement of the figure on A may reflect the ambitions of its patrons or the individual it commemorates, asserting their status as local lords or landholders, while the accompanying weapons may have been intended to denote Scandinavian social affiliations. The planar arrangement further underscores the socio-political ambitions of those responsible for erecting the monument, enabling the portrait to assume aspects of the immaterial. While the beast on sea can certainly be viewed as a Scandinavian stylistic development, this does not preclude the possibility that it carried Christian symbolic significances alluded to by the human figure's removal from temporal events and their shared position in relation to the crosshead. Viewing the Middleton arrangement against the cross form consciously selected for its display reveals the multivalent nature of its carvings, which facilitates understandings of the monument that encompass both sacred and secular significances rather than singular ethnic affiliations. Thank you.